So thank you for coming at La Robe Numérique podcast. And so, Max, can you explain us how everything began?
I guess there's different beginnings in the sense of I think I was interested in computers already as a little kid, taking everything apart. And I think many people that work in privacy are usually the people that love technology as well. And I think that's always important to highlight. And then I was in high school in Florida, and that was the first time when in our school in Florida, everything was like digitalized. There was like a number for everything. There was a CCTV cameras all over the place. And it was like a bit of a different situation in Austria where the teachers also had to type in within 2 minutes if you were there or not. And if they didn't do it, then there was someone from the front office calling them. So you had this feeling of like a kind of little police state there at this high school, even though it was in a countryside, middle of nowhere, so not like, south of Chicago or something. I think that was the second time I was like, okay, that's a bit weird, or we have a different view maybe on that or a different culture. And then the third round was basically when I was studying in California for half a year, which was a bit of a semester off for me. And we had people from the big tech companies, and they basically said, it's all nice and funny what the Europeans do with their privacy stuff. But if you violate the law, nothing happens anyway. So why should we? Which, from a lawyer's perspective, is probably a logical way of thinking about it. But was probably the trigger also to look into that more. And to be honest, that's probably still a topic I'm connected to today, because in privacy world, it's probably not necessarily just understanding what the violation is and bringing that up, but really the enforcement and this kind of like laissez-faire of, let's just do it anyways and nothing is going to happen. And if so, then we're just going to say sorry.
And that's it.
Exactly.
But now they paid. It's not only say sorry and it's not okay.
Yeah, we're starting to see the first penalties, and I think that's an important message. But still, when you talk to most DPOs, we hear a lot of frustration to say, I told my boss 20 times we can't do it. But if I have to tell them, what is going to be the consequence, the answer is like, not much. And then the business decision is made to do it anyways. And so it depends on the company culture, obviously, and it's extremely different in the sector that you're in. But we hear that more and more, that after the first GDPR wave of, okay, let's just make sure we have a privacy policy and do the basics, that now where we have to look into more of the details, that there is oftentimes people have struggling to get it forward. But I'm not an expert. We basically hear it, and then we see the end result of going to a website and be like, "Oh, how the fuck did you?" Yeah.
And did GAFAM try to contact you, recruit you, or silence you since you begin?
Not really. So, usually for them, they usually try to ignore you mainly, because the more they answer to an NGO or to a activist at the beginning or a student at the beginning, the more they legitimize it. So the more they just say, okay, irrelevant, crazy person, the better it works. And that was interesting, for example, for the data transfers. That worked really well for the US until the first Court of Justice decision. We're basically not reported in the US at all. And American journalists told you, it's like student against big company, not going to happen, and then when we actually won, the Europeans were like more David versus Goliath, cool. And in the American thing is like, what the fuck just happened? Like this just is not foreseen that anybody wins against a company. And I think that made it even more of possible. A story. And I think that's a bit where it's really, really, really hard to bring these cases and push them through. But I'm at least a little bit proud of the European legal system, that it is, with a lot of effort and really not easy, still possible that you bring a case like that, because in the US it's just not that easy to go to the Supreme Court.
It's really too expensive and it's very complicated.
Extremely political and all that drama that happens. So I think there is some good things that happen there.
And regarding the data transfer beyond EU borders, is it clear that politicians are not follow the advice of EDPB or any DPA in Europe?
Yeah,
what is your point of view regarding?
Yeah, so I think it's mainly what the Court of Justice says. And the EDPB has a lot of papers that make a lot of sense, but it's also a very political body. And especially in the data transfers, we know that the authorities are not keen on enforcing it. Even when we bring cases, they find a reason not to do anything. They've never really, I think 1 or 2 DPAs in small cases have ever brought up data transfers themselves. But otherwise, they are not politically convinced that that is an important topic. So I think the DPAs are probably not, they kind of accept it, are probably neutral on the topic, or accept that that's not the rule, but they're not. It's not in the forefront of their topics that they want to deal with. Let's put it that way. So I think the EDPB was never like the big player we looked into here. It's really the Court of Justice. And I think that is the more problematic situation that we have, even that we do have a Supreme Court in the European Union that told us twice now, this is not, you can't do it.
Commission.
And politics just moves on and does it anyways. We have a similar situation with data retention, where basically the Court of Justice again and again and again and again tells everybody, no, you can't do data retention, and the member states still do it. And I think that is something that triggers me more than the privacy discussion, is kind of this rule of law question of, if we have a Supreme Court, and you may agree and you may disagree, and I definitely disagree with a lot of stuff that comes out of courts, but there is an ultimate arbitrator in a rule of law system that you can criticize, but you cannot just ignore. And I think the Commission ignores it. Exactly, the Commission ignores it. The member states to a certain extent, also the DPAs, and we have in the data transfer situation kind of a big Mikado, as you would call it in German, like all the little sticks that just no one wants to move. And it's basically the companies say, okay, the DPA should give us guidance, but actually when they give us guidance to say, don't do it, then we don't want to hear that guidance. Then also during the GDPR, we wanted to have regulated self-regulation. So we wanted to regulate data transfers ourselves, but now we actually have to do a transfer impact assessment. We are worried about it. Then the authorities are worried to actually enforce it because they would be the ones killing the internet. Then kind of Europe looks to the US saying, how about the big US tech companies? They could put pressure on and stop it, or move their operations to Europe and separate it. They say, really, you're not running away, so why should we do anything? Then there's US politics that basically says, okay, if the US industry doesn't push us, why should we move? Because fuck Europeans and their rights, because they're not Americans, they don't have any rights. So you have like this system where everybody is just in a wait and see mode. And it seems we're just going in the third round of this washing circle, and I don't know how many washes we are on until we're finally coming out dry here. And so, but that is a bit the situation. It's kind of frustrating because a lot of energy by everybody, a lot of time is wasted on this. What is the Court of Justice going to say? Yeah, I mean, Hungary, we have a problem that the election of judges is in this really detailed problematic under Article 74 of the Charter. But hey, in the US, there's no court at all. That's fine.
So it's all fine. Yeah,
yeah, it's going to be really interesting because there is still this idea of, if the US does it, it's somehow okay, or we can't touch it. And for the Court of Justice, there's going to be just a very practical problem. It's Article 74 of the Charter, and it's the same if it's Hungary or Poland or someone else or the US, and there is no US.
Morocco, everywhere.
And they would basically have to overturn all their case law on privacy in Europe when it comes to data retention and so on. They would have to overturn all their case law into access to justice under 47 to somehow say that this new executive order is wonderful and great. And that structurally is going to be, even if the judges would want to kind of like get let go, going to be very, very problematic for them, because anybody that knows the fabric of EU law, or especially Court of Justice law, how should that ever get through that fabric? But there's still wishful thinking, and I think to a large extent people expect this to go down another time, but there's still this hope of, maybe we can get it over with somehow, or just save another 2-3 years and then, whatever.
And come again and again. So
exactly.
How do you... how many Schrems judgments do we have? And we're going to have?
It seems we're going to have a third one. To be honest, I'm really not motivated to do this anymore. Like, I think no one is, but it really becomes a rule of law question of, can the Commission just issue the same thing over and over and over again by just putting a new name on it? And yes, there are changes, but if you really look at it, they're so tiny. And I think the big problem is that a lot of the lawyers also don't look at the underlying US law. They hear, okay, there's a new court, wonderful and great. But no one checks that actually the same system existed under PPD 28 before. Now you have to compare these two executive orders and say, okay, what is the delta? What is really better here? What is the difference? And if you really put these texts side by side, you will realize it's largely the same. There are even parts where it got worse. And then there are parts where it got better, but it's a bit like if the Court of Justice says you have to put up a wall, and now they say, oh, but we made a wall, it's just 1 centimeter high. It's just like,
it's a very small wall.
It's a very small wall. But is that going to impress anybody?
It's
and
only
obviously,
for 3 years old. Okay?
Yeah, and especially, if you say the wall was 1 centimeter and now it's 2 centimeters, yeah, it's a bigger wall, but it's not going to, help
it's not
you.
Enough.
And so it's really, all of this became a very non-legal, non-evidence-based political debate where people just want a solution. And I would love to have a solution. To be honest, if the executive order would solve all the problems, I could run around and say, woohoo, I managed that the NSA can't do these things anymore. I'm the greatest person ever seen. But it just doesn't do it. And just pretending is, I know kind of the sports of politics of the last 10 or 20 years, that pretending is good enough. But as a lawyer, pretending is not good enough. It just has to be, really backed by facts as well.
And what it could be the best leverage to convince a company to comply?
I think right now, there's different ways. If you really want to be efficient and just look from a time... I think from a company perspective, there's really the view that you can say, if it's really just about money, then probably not complying right now is making sense. However, what I think a lot of them underestimate is the cost of compliance, the cost of overhead, the cost of generating all these papers, having all the advice and whatever. And, sometimes they're like, yeah, there's a local provider, but it's 20% more expensive. It's like, the money that you spend on lawyers and privacy professionals and all the other people.
And the risk.
And the risk and all the re-engineering you will have to do at some point anyways. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's a wise business decision to just say, fuck it anyways. And some law firm is just going to do it. Yeah, it's easier. And it's also a risk-shifting exercise. Like everybody shifts the risk to the next. The CEO shifts it to the DPO. The DPO shifts it to a law firm. And the law firm says, if you pay me enough, I'll write you that everything is fine. And then everybody's happy. But that is not really, a long-term strategy. And we see very different approaches depending on the business circles. There are some that are more honest about that and really try to fix things, and others that are a bit more risk takers, as they call them.
Okay. What do you the most proud of?
The most proud of? I'm generally not a person that is proud of many things. So that's a tricky question for me. I think generally what Neub has developed into is like one of these kind of, forces for moving stuff forward. I think that worked rather well. If you start something like that, you always have the illusion that all of that should work much better and quicker and should be done in a year. And then you realize that it just takes forever. So I think that is probably what I'm the most proud of in that sense, that there is now a bubble of people that want to work in the right direction and that are really, I think, to a certain extent, we're pacemakers also for the authorities that oftentimes, on the one hand, get annoyed by us pushing them. I understand because it's work and so on. But at the same time, also, I think a lot of times get inspired. So a lot of the European authorities also invited me to just basically give an inspirational speech to their own staff to say, guys, you can do something. And I think that is interesting how that develops.
Hannah, my last question. How can we support Neub?
Oh, yeah. So there's multiple things. First of all, we're donation driven. So that's the easiest way to support. That's a couple of clicks. Otherwise, usually we do have, for especially people in the field, we have GDPR Hub, which is like a knowledge platform where people can find decisions and so on. We're always looking for volunteers there to help us summarize decisions and so on. And then one thing that's really interesting is if people find issues where they're like, okay, there is a concrete privacy issue. Ideally, I have the evidence or I can lead you to it. We're also always super interested if people send us stuff over. That can be done just via email, or we even have like a secure drop where people can anonymously send us stuff. So I think that's typically the different ways of putting stuff out. Plus, obviously, sharing and promoting what we do is always great and appreciated.
Okay, thank you so much for coming in La Robe Numérique podcast and hope to have a Schrems III because we need to stop that kind of.
Thanks a lot.
Pressure. Thank you.
Thank you.